So, thanks for joining me, everybody. Uh, so, I'm going to talk about a couple of herbs and then about compound maceration and the ideas behind that. But first, I want to talk about going for a walk earlier today. I would really encourage everybody who gets a chance to spend some time outside this time of year. I know that this weekend it's supposed to be really cold, but even so, even if it is, and especially on days when it's not, it's a really good time to get outside in the wintertime. And it's really good to see what nature is doing at this time of year and spend some time looking at it. And so that's what I did today. I went for a little bit of a walk just here in town, kind of on a walking trail in a neighborhood. But there's a lot to notice that's going on in nature right now. And you kind of might get the impression without looking too closely that everything is just sort of dormant right now. But actually, there's a whole lot going on in the natural world and the plant world specifically around us right now if you're looking for it. So yeah, today I took a short walk, went through an area where there were some trees and some not a completely unmowed field, but maybe something that hadn't been mowed for a few months, or maybe had only been mowed a couple times this year or whatever. Sort of more of a meadow type habitat than a lawn, in other words. And some of the things you might notice, some of the things that you might notice right away would be what the animals are doing, but that's directly related to what the plants are doing too. Which right now, certain animals like cardinals and squirrels are very visible. They are doing a lot of foraging right now. They're trying to stock up on all the calories that they can. With squirrels in particular, they're pretty chubby right now. At least the ones here in town are. There's a lot of food around, but it's been warm, so they have not been like hiding from the weather as much. And because there hasn't been a layer of snow on the ground or anything like that, there's still a lot of mast on the ground they can get to. Seeds from nuts from trees, like walnuts and acorns, are still laying on the ground where these animals can forage them. And in the case of smaller seeds, not nuts, but smaller seeds, the cardinals eat them too. Cardinals don't ever really get fat because then they wouldn't be able to fly, I guess. But the squirrels, they bulk up going into winter if they can. And they have certainly seemed to be very successful with that project this year. So lots of masts still laying on the ground from fall, lots of nuts, seeds, things like that. Another thing that's going on in the plant world right now is that winter annuals are sprouting and starting to grow. So if you look in areas that are not just completely dominated by grass, maybe areas where the ground is a little more bare, things like old garden beds or shadier spaces right under trees where there might not be as much grass, and any kind of ground that was disturbed earlier in the year. Any kind of ground that was disturbed earlier in the year, there will likely be certain plants growing on it. And this would include chickweed, maybe the occasional dandelion, but more dead nettle. That's lamium, which is in the mint family. Not actual nettles that are dead, but a completely separate plant that just happens to be called dead nettle. So lamium and veronica, also known as speedwell, is starting to grow right now. Certain types of cress are really sprouting right now. Winter cresses, which are spicy, mustardy greens. Cardamine tinctoria is the main species around here, but there are some other ones too. And all of these are growing right now because this time of year, when there isn't a leafy canopy up above them, they can gather sunlight that wouldn't be available the rest of the year. So they grow in the winter, they put out their leaves in the winter, soak up the winter sunlight. Well, they don't have to compete for it with the other plants, and then bloom and go to seed right before the trees leaf out in the spring. So all of those plants are growing right now, sprouting, growing. Occasionally you'll see a little bloom here or there, but mostly that comes later. So these are all plants that are taking advantage of the leaflessness of the trees and the fact that solar energy is reaching the ground. And so they're, using this opportunity because they've developed cold tolerance to make up for the fact that they're not tall plants that can catch this first rays of sunlight coming in the rest of the year. They're making up for that by growing when it's cold. And so if you look under trees or in old garden beds and places like that, like I described, you'll see a lot of these plants coming up right now. A lot of sprouts coming up, which might have a mustardy flavor to them. Some of these are going to be the cardamine and other winter cresses. Some of them are going to be garlic mustard, which is another introduced plant that's in the mustard family that thrives in disturbed areas, places that humans have dug up or otherwise changed the shape of. It will grow in very poor soil, doesn't really need topsoil. So it will grow in, it grows a lot in parks and old fields and roadsides and things like that. And I think we've maybe seen it on some of our herb walks too, but it's a mustardy, garlicky, well, it tastes garlicky, but it's in the mustard family. And mullein, yeah, Becca mentions that she's had a mullein plant pop up recently. So mullein is growing right now. Mullein in Kentucky will grow all winter. There will be rosettes of mullein on the ground, some of which will have grown, some of which will have just started growing at the end of this past season. So in late summer, early fall, the mulleins go to seed and drop their seeds on the ground. So there will be some new mullein coming up from those. There will also still be last year's mullein, which started growing from last year's seed, grew all summer long, will continue to collect energy all winter long. It won't really grow that much usually. It'll usually kind of get to a certain size and then stop. But it will continue to be there and it will continue to soak up sunlight. And then next year, it will send up a flowering stem and go to seed itself. So it's a biennial that often starts growing in the winter and often persists through the following winter. And then dies after it goes to seed. So there's a lot of that going on right now in the natural world. Winter annuals, and there are a lot of persistent fruits. Persistent fruits are fruits that grow on a tree and just kind of hang out there, or grow on a plant and just kind of hang out there for months, often late into the winter. So certain species of hawthorns might still have their berries on them, or might have just recently dropped them to the ground. There's also sumac, which is a favorite of birds, something a lot of birds eat the seeds of. Sumac is a small shrub, and it has a lot of little red fuzzy fruits on it. I call them berries, but they're really not berries. They're really just kind of, they're not like fleshy the way that we would usually think of a berry, but they're small and round and red and kind of velvety, and they taste like sour candy, very sweet and sour. And those will hang out on the stems pretty much all winter long and fall off towards the end of winter and start growing when it's springtime, the ones that the birds haven't eaten. So Those are around. There are some other bushes and things that might still have some fruits on them. And those are a source of food for animals in the winter. They can be a source of food for humans in the winter as well, if that's what you're looking for, if that's what you're into. The other thing that you would see in the natural world right now that is kind of especially noticeable this time of year, and is part of plants that are kind of part of the strategy of plants that are utilizing this winter time to get things done, is fluffiness. There are certain plants that have fluffy seed. The fruit is, or the seed is attached to some fluff that helps it to get distributed on the wind. So if you go out and look at goldenrod right now, where goldenrod a few months ago was, big yellow, tall yellow flowers, very brightly colored. Now you'll see that the plant looks dead, it's just a dried out stem, but on top of the stem, there will be a little bit of fluff. And that is part of its seed distribution process. Those little bits of fluff get blown around and carry seeds with them. Similar to what a dandelion does, although dandelions don't do it in the wintertime. Not very much anyway, hardly at all. Cattails make a lot of fluff this time of year. So the cattail stems, if you have a pond or a ditch full of water or whatever that had cattails in it this year, if you go and look at them right now, probably those corn dog shaped structures on the top of them are all turning into fluff and distributing into the wind right now. And the reason that happens this time of year for a lot of plants, or the reason it's beneficial for the plants for that to happen at this time of year, is because there aren't as many obstacles. The plants in the fields have just kind of died down. The trees don't have leaves on them. So fields and forests are much more passable to a bit of fluff flowing on the wind than they would have been a few months ago when all the brambles had leaves on them and all the tall plants that are now just bare stalks were covered in leaves. So you can see that process unfolding before you at this time of year. And that's actually, these plants propagating themselves. Sycamore is another one. Sycamore trees, which are large trees with white branches and a brown trunk. And right now they have balls of fluff on them, which are the plant's fruit. And the ball of fluff breaks apart. It's like a fuzzy ball, and it breaks apart into little bits of fluff, and they get distributed by wind and by water. They get blown by the wind, and they also will float in water. And a sycamore tree will produce tons of them, lots and lots of them. And it does at this time of year because at this time of year, they can get carried further on the wind than they would when the forests are more full of leaves and less passable to the wind. So that's another wintertime process that's unfolding all around us with the plants that you can see if you are present in nature and if you are spending time looking at the plants. And so, even though it's cold outside, I strongly encourage everyone who's able to get outside and look at the plants. It may not be cold where you're living. It's kind of cold here in Kentucky. It's supposed to get cold later, but it hasn't really been very cold so far. It's been a very mild December so far. But wherever you live and whatever season it is where you are, I would encourage everybody to get out very frequently and look at what's going on and what's changing in the natural world around you at this time of year compared to a few weeks ago or a few months ago, because that is how you build a connection to the land. And that's how you get to know the plants and get to know the plants that live where you live and that you might want to be able to use. And just like it's easier for the bits of fluff blowing on the wind to get around, there are things about right now that are easier for humans too. You can see further through the woods, you can see further through the fields sometimes, and some of them are also more traversable on foot than they would have been when everything was all overgrown. I really like, as someone who forages for food, I like to go out in the wintertime and notice where things are, because it's a lot easier if you learn the trees well enough to recognize them by their bark. You can recognize where the oak trees are that are going to have acorns, where the walnut trees are that are going to have walnuts, where the raspberry canes are that are going to have raspberries. And none of those things are going to have food on them right now. Nut trees might have some laying on the ground, but that's more for the squirrels, not necessarily fit for human consumption. But unless you're really, really hungry. But it lets you notice where all these things are, which is easier to do when there are less leaves intervening in your line of sight. So it's a really good time for scouting out the area around you. You might notice things that you never noticed before, and find plants that you weren't already aware were with you. And also, it will, if you're going out on a weekly basis, for instance, and just getting out in nature for a little bit of time every week, a little bit of time frequently, you'll get to see how things change and how things unfold, and kind of familiarize yourself with and involve yourself in the cycles of nature that are going on around you. And as a serious student of herbal medicine, I think that's like a really important thing to be able to do, if possible, is to get out there and make yourself aware of these changing cycles that are going on around you, and give yourself the experience of directly interacting with them. And it being cold is part of that, but maybe too cold now, too hot in the summer might not always be comfortable, but you learn how to make yourself comfortable by being out in it too. So that's an important thing to do, and I strongly encourage everybody to do it. And I hope I have not gotten too preachy about the subject. So one of the herbs that I want to talk about today is viburnum. Viburnum is a genus of bushes, and there are a couple different kinds around. There are a lot of viburnums that are planted by people, and there are also viburnums that happen on their own in the woods. They're wild. And viburnum has essentially three different parts that we use medicinally. Three different parts that I use medicinally. The seed and the berry, or the fruit and the seed, are less used, and the bark has been kind of an official herbal medicine in pharmacopoeias and a very commonly used traditional medicine for a long, long time. And so it's kind of the more familiar part of the plant to use as medicine. And like with a lot of other plants out there, the reason that became the familiar part that's used as medicine is at least partly because it's very shippable, it's very storable. The fruit is not as much. So I'm going to talk about the fruit first. The fruit is people call it a berry, but it's got a single seed inside, so it's not exactly a berry. I think it's a single seed. Anyway, it's a small fleshy fruit, berry-like fruit. People sometimes call certain species of it high bush cranberry. It's not closely related to cranberries at all. There's a type of blueberry called high bush blueberry, so it's just named that with a kind of analogy to that. But it tastes like cranberry when it's red. So the berries, the fruits, are red, and then they turn dark purple, almost black. And they can be eaten in either state. When they're red, they taste very much like cranberries. They're very sour, tart, slightly astringent. And just like cranberries, the acidity that's in them will stimulate the kidneys and be a mild diuretic. And just like cranberries, they contain some some reddish colored proanthocyanidins that are antioxidants. So, and they're pretty good tasting. Most people find them pretty acceptable flavors. Once they turn ripe, they're purple, almost black, and they're very rich in antioxidants. They're very sweet. They've lost their tartness and astringency for the most part. There's something about the taste that a lot of people don't like. So the red berries, the unripe fruits, taste and act somewhat like cranberries. The more ripe ones taste and act more like prunes. They're not astringent. They're more fibrous. More fibery. They're very rich in antioxidants, have a slight laxative effect, and they've lost that diuretic effect that the sour fruit has. However, the seed is strongly constipating. So if you actually crush up the seed and take that as medicine, which it can be crushed up and encapsulated or just eaten, that's very constipating. It's very, I would say it's not the strongest thing out there for stopping diarrhea, but it's pretty strong. It's pretty strong to the point where, I would hesitate to use it. Usually I would use black walnut as like maybe the first thing if I wanted something that would actually constipate somebody. Black walnut might be one of the first things I would try. Viburnum is a step up from that. Anything poppy-ish like California poppy or regular opium poppies would be a stage stronger than that. Usually I don't want to cause constipation in people. Most of the time, if there is diarrhea, I want to treat whatever is causing the diarrhea to be happening, whether that's inflammation or infection or what have you, rather than just suppressing the symptom. But sometimes, if somebody is having very severe diarrhea and it's depleting them, then sometimes it's necessary. And that's something you would see maybe with food poisoning, where you would, if somebody had eaten something like some meat that had gone bad, or another place that I've seen it is drinking impure water, or people just get, scouring diarrhea, that you obviously want to do something about the bacterial infection that's causing the scouring diarrhea, but you also want to give the person some ease and some relief while you're waiting for that to happen. So in this case, you might do something like the viburnum seed to slow down the movement, and then maybe something like an artemisia like wormwood to try and kill off the bacteria that are causing the problem. So that is a use of that part of the plant. The other part of the plant that is more widely used, like I said, is the bark. And the bark is a really interesting, nice medicine. It's a good thing to have around. Early on in my practice, I used it a lot. It was something that I had abundant access to, and it was a very traditional remedy in the community that I came from, a widely used remedy in the community that I came from. And so I used it quite a bit. I find that I haven't been using it as much in recent years. And that has probably more to do with the fact that that I'm sourcing it myself and going out and gathering it, stuff like that, rather than anything about it's probably more to do with availability than efficacy. But it is it's astringent, it's warming, and it is sedative, slightly sedative, antispasmodic type of thing. So it calms the muscles, calms the body, and it's really good for cramps. Cramp bark is one of the traditional names for it. So Viburnum prunifolium is a very common species to use for that. There's also Viburnum opulus. So prunifolium means that it has leaves like prunus, like cherries or peaches or plums. Viburnum acerifolium has more of a maple leaf shaped leaf. And then there's Viburnum alnifolia, which has a leaf shaped like alnus, which is the alder. So in no case does the leaf look exactly like the thing that it's named after, but they have very different leaf shapes that are somewhat reminiscent of other trees. And then they have these clusters of flowers and fruit, some of which are blooming right now. I saw a viburnum bush a few days ago that was in bloom, that had a few blooms here and there on it. So it's not its main time to be in bloom, but it does actually apparently have what it needs to be able to bloom even in this time of year, and does so a little bit, like blooming on a reduced schedule. And it is pollinated by bees, so there's still bees around pollinating. Most of our native bees live in the ground, and or maybe not most, a lot of our native bees live in the ground, and so they don't always, sometimes they persist after it freezes. They'll stay in the ground and stay alive and come out when the weather's a little bit warmer. But you might see them on a warm day, even if it's in the midst of a cold week. So cramp bark can be used for menstrual cramps, and it can be used for cramping in the digestive system that often comes along with diarrhea or nausea. And it can also be used for cramping in skeletal muscles. It's like Charlie horses, things like that, where someone's muscle just is cramping involuntarily. And of course, when that's happening, it's important for the person to stretch. It's important for the person to keep that part of their body warm, to stay hydrated, to make sure they're getting proper electrolytes. So there are a lot of things that are, more root causes that you would want to be making sure are addressed. But sometimes the cramp bark is really helpful with that. It contains some of the same antispasmodic substances that are in valerian. It also contains some astringents and some alkaloids that are entirely its own. And if you drink a tea made from it, which you would make as a decoction, it's slightly, I guess you could say slightly spicy, just very faintly warm tasting, beyond just the warmth of the beverage itself. It has a slightly warm taste to it. And so it's something that is helpful for conditions that are made worse by cold, or types of pain that are made worse by cold, like cramping and stiffness. If someone has arthritic joints that are made worse by stiffness of the muscles, it's helpful with that. I've used it in people who have Parkinson's disease, who have they have shaking of their muscles that's involuntary, and it helps a little bit with that, but it especially helps with the pain and stiffness that results from the muscle fatigue from shaking. So it's sort of not like a main treatment for Parkinson's, but something that I often use along with other things in that type of situation. So it works for menstrual cramps, and it works on calming contractions of the uterus, which, I mean, cramps are, but also if someone is starting to, if someone is seeming like they might start to have a miscarriage or go into labor earlier than they should, this is something that has traditionally been used for that. And so it's something that can be used in that situation, should that sort of situation arise. Yeah, just good in general for keeping the uterus from contracting too hard, or at a time when it's not wanted to be doing so. And With the intestinal stuff, it's a similar type of thing. It's just warming and soothing to the smooth muscles, which are the involuntary muscles that line the organs. So for using it on rabbits, I actually don't know how it would be in rabbits. You can use it on humans in premature labor. Whether rabbits metabolize it the same way and whether it would have the same effect on them is not something that I would be willing to guarantee. I think that it would, but I've never tried it, and I don't know anybody that has. So if you find out, let me know. But the compound valeric acid is like, based on how that works physiologically, it's likely that it would do the same thing to rabbit muscle contractions as it does to human muscle contractions, because it's a very basic chemical that's interacting with a very basic part of how muscles contract. But I don't know for sure that, that it wouldn't get broken down by some other enzyme or something like that in rabbits in a way that it doesn't in humans, because their metabolism and their absorption and so forth is different than ours. But I think that it would for any animal, but I'm not sure with rabbits specifically. Yeah, just a moment. All right. Yeah. So that's viburnum, and like other barks, you want to harvest viburnum bark when the sap is running, which is usually late February through early April or so. If you harvest it at that time of year, you can peel the sap very easily off of the sticks. And the nice thing about viburnum bushes is that they have lots of small straight sticks that you can trim and leave the bush in place. You can harvest a lot of bark from one bush without harming the bush, just by pruning off branches and letting new ones grow to take its place. So it's different types of viburnum are very popular as landscaping, not trees, bushes, landscaping plants. So and they'll persist. If somebody plants a viburnum, and then you come back 50 years later, it's probably still there. It's probably still there. They're long lived and they're pretty persistent, and they can grow from their own seeds, but they usually don't, at least not around here. So if you find a place where they're growing, they don't usually spread or become invasive or anything. Out in the woods, you usually find them along creeks or along a lot of the time, if somebody has done dozer work through a part of the woods and has like carved out a road or something like that, they'll grow on the banks of that, just like they would grow on the banks of a creek. And it's not so much that they need to be next to the water, it's that they like to be kind of overhanging the empty space, and they like to get the sunlight that comes down in between the trees. So they will grow as an understory plant, but they like to grow where there are breaks in the understory, and not have anything else kind of crowding right up against them. So that's the viburnum, and it's pretty good. It's a very traditional Appalachian medicine. It's not something that is very it's not something that's super widely used in the world of herbalists in the United States, but it's pretty well known. Most people know cramp bark, maybe use it some, but it's a good resource to know about. A good versatile herb, and it's very well tolerated and safe, and has a pretty pronounced effect. It usually makes a big difference in people that take it. Low back pain is another thing that I use it for, because low back pain is often hard to treat, hard to assess exactly why they're having low back pain. And often, even if you know what it's from their job, and the person needs to keep doing it because they need to eat and all that sort of thing. So low back pain can be hard to treat and hard to deal with, but viburnum is pretty helpful with that, because it does give these muscles a chance to relax that are sometimes having to do too much to hold up the person, and to often we're using our low back muscles in ways that aren't really what they're made for when we're doing occupation type stuff. If you're like bending over and picking stuff up, or bending and lifting and twisting or whatever. If you're working on an assembly line, for instance, or even if you're working at a desk and you're kind of hunched over the desk, you're probably asking your lower back muscles to do something that they were not meant to do for a prolonged time, which is to hold up the weight of your upper body with their muscle tension as you lean over. And they can do that for a while, and they can do it all day, but it hurts them eventually. So they're not really made to do it all day, but they do their best to adapt. So viburnum in that situation is both warming and relaxing to those muscles. So it can be really part of a helpful strategy. The other herb that I'm going to talk about today is fir. Fir is a tree. It's a conifer. People might think of it as being like a pine tree, but it's kind of pretty different from an actual pine tree. Has different needles and everything. Closer to a spruce tree. But fir is it's a very aromatic, cool herb that is useful as a decongestant, and it's useful as, oh, hang on just a second. Yeah, it's useful as a decongestant, and it does increase circulation as well. Topically, it's a little bit of a pain reliever and a fairly good antiseptic. So you can make an extract of the needles of fir, and it is pretty much it's a pretty good remedy. A lot of the time you'll have actually this instead, which is the sap from the fir. People might call that fir balsam or fir pitch. And that's kind of a more concentrated form of it, but it's not necessarily explicitly or exclusively better than if you were to make a tincture out of the needles. The fir has different physical the pitch has different physical properties. It's more tarry, it's more sticky. It can be used as an adhesive for I've used it. One thing that I've done is dissolve it in an equal part of pure alcohol and use that as sort of an adhesive to glue on a patch. Like if there were a wound, rather than stitching it, you could put the fir sap around it, dissolved in an equal part of alcohol, which will quickly evaporate. and then use that as an adhesive and as well as an antiseptic, um, and glue a piece of sterile cotton over it. And that creates a wound dressing that will stay on, and it will help to keep the wound, hold the wound closed in a strong way. So that's something that you can do with the sap that you wouldn't be able to do with the needles. But if you just made a tincture of the needles, particularly the tips, not the darker, fully mature needles that are hardened, but the new ones that are growing, that are more juicy, that are at the tips of the branches. This question, can you glue the actual wound? Yeah, you can glue the actual wound. It will sting if you get something with alcohol in the wound, but you can actually glue it. And it will help to hold the wound closed. So with the needles, they're very good as an antiseptic if it's used as a wash. They're also very good as a decongestant, which the balsam is too. Sometimes people have also burned the needles and breathed in the smoke as a way of provoking coughing that would break up congestion. That's an iffy thing to do because you're breathing in smoke, but it does tend to provoke coughing if it's a situation where it's going to be a productive cough. So that's not something that I necessarily, that's one of those things that I consider to be kind of a dramatic measure that might not be that helpful. And so it's not usually something that I would do. The fur, if it's made into a decoction and drunk, it's somewhat nutritious. It contains some digestible carbohydrates. It contains some vitamin C and some minerals. If you make a tincture out of it, you get more of the resiny stuff than you would from a hot water extract, although some of it disperses in the hot water as well. So it can be prepared each of those different ways. The inner bark of the tree can also be used medicinally. It can be cooked and eaten. It's not all that nutritious, but it's something that has served people as a famine food in times of desperate need. And because it's very fibrous, and because it has tensile strength in one direction but not the other. So if you pull on the direction that the fibers are growing, it won't tear. If you pull the other way, it will tear. So that is something that can be used as a wound dressing as well. You could actually, if you didn't have sterile cotton, you could use a piece of the inner bark from the tree itself, which I also think I described doing with white pine earlier on in this course. But it's strong in one direction and very breakable in the other direction. So you can tear strips of it off. You can cut those to length with scissors or other tools, and then it will be very strong in one direction and can be used to pull a wound closed if it's glued down on one side, and then pulled till it closes the wound, and then glued down on the other. So yeah, it's possible when we do the weekend intensive, which is going to be in April. I might do a workshop on wound care where we look at some and practice some techniques for wound dressing that might be things that I've explained that might be more better understood through practice than through just explanation. Yeah, okay. So yeah, that's basically a good overview of fur. Yeah, I'm stoked about the intensive too. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to have some good very practical hands-on skills that you can get the knack of in a fairly short amount of time, and that will stay with you for the rest of your life. So I hope that everybody who is able will make it to that, and that everybody who is not able to make it to that will at least get to see it, see some demonstrations via video. It's, yeah. Okay. So today I wanted to talk about making compound macerations. So last time we talked about doing extracts that involve multiple phases, um, like making a hot water extract and an alcohol extract from the same mushroom and then combining them. This time, I'm going to talk about something that is almost the opposite of that in a way, which is making an extract of multiple different things in the same process. Combining herbs and making them together in one process of extraction. So I guess the kind of archetypal example of this would be a tea blend. You know, you could have multiple different things that you pour hot water over, and they all extract together into the same hot water. And that's, you know, that's a very simple type of compound maceration. It's very short too, because it's only macerating or steeping for a few minutes, or for maybe not even a minute, depending on what you're putting in there. But so, you know, if you think about chai, maybe you would have the black tea, which contains caffeine, and then you would have some spices that are warming, like cardamom and ginger and whatever else, cinnamon, nutmeg, and then the hot water would be extracting the caffeine and the theophylline and the tannins from the tea, and that same hot water containing the theophylline and the caffeine and the tannins would be permeating through the other herbs and conducting out the substances that are in them. So the downside to doing it this way, the couple of downsides to doing it this way, one is that you can't separate them back out once they've been combined, and the other is that the total bulk of plant material is going to absorb, because there's more plant material, it might absorb more of each of the medicines, each of the constituents. So some of at the end of the process, some of the caffeine is going to end up inside the other spices, inside the, you know, spent hulls of the other spices, and some of those substances that have come out of those other spices are going to end up in the spent tea leaves. So there is a little bit of perhaps less efficiency in that, in terms of how the extraction is happening. But at the same time, the substances might actually help extract what is in the other herbs. So for example, let's see. Well, let's say we did one with ginseng and spice bush together, or ginseng and sassafras maybe. The saponins from the ginseng are actually, because of their molecular structure, going to help solubilize some of the oleoresins and volatile oils that are in the sassafras. So they're going to actually be helping with the process of extraction and maybe getting a higher concentration of those substances out of the sassafras in the first place. So in some situations, it can be a synergistic thing where the constituents from one plant are acting as part of the solvent that is taking out the substances from the other plant. So in the case of ginseng, these saponicides that are in it, they're kind of like soapy molecules. And because they're soapy, they're helping to scrub away or wash away or take out the greasy stuff that is in the sassafras that might not as easily disperse in plain water. So that is something that is synergistic, that might be helping, where one herb might be helping to take the stuff out of another herb. So that doesn't necessarily always happen with blends, but it is a thing that can happen. And it is also possible for substances from two herbs to combine together into a substance that was not originally found in either one. It is possible that there could be a chemical reaction between two of the substances, or that certain molecules could kind of find each other in the solution and either form compounds or complexes where they're just kind of magnetically attached to each other without being chemically combined. So it is possible to actually get some, what you might think of as alchemical changes happening between the herbs that are being combined in a compound maceration. So yeah, a tea blend is one example of that. And a lot of the time, what we're doing when we're making a blend is we're just thinking, what are some things that I would be likely to have together on a consistent basis, such that I would want to make a batch of it already combined. So another example of a well-known compound maceration would be fire cider. Fire cider is cider or vinegar extract of a bunch of different spicy herbs, or spicy vegetables, you might even call them. Things like ginger, garlic, peppers, maybe onions, maybe cloves, chopped up, put it in the jar together and covered with apple cider vinegar or apple cider, and then allowed to steep. And so in that situation, you get a bunch of different spicy things combined with a medicinal extracting medium, so that the vinegar itself is widely used as a remedy. Each of the herbs that are in it are used as a remedy, and they're all working together because they're all decongestant. They're all things that increase circulation. So they're all helping to move the juices in the body, which is in Ayurvedic medicine, a remedy that does that is called rasayana. Rasayana has a pretty broad set of meanings, but fundamentally it means rasa means juice and yana means path. So it's like it's working on the pathways that bodily fluids flow through. So it's fire cider would be a good example of this because it's helping to dilate the blood vessels. It's helping to break up phlegm. It's making people sweat. So it's working on all these different movements of bodily fluids and promoting the movement, which means that it's reducing stagnation. By the nature of the stuff that's in it, it's also reducing inflammation. And so fire cider is apparently a traditional remedy from Vermont, but it was popularized, or maybe not specifically Vermont, but the Northeast. It was popularized in the 70s by an herbalist named Rosemary Gladstar. And she wrote about it. She's taught a lot of people about it. She's still alive, and she's one of the people who really play the biggest role in the popularization of herbal medicine in the late 20th century in America. So she wrote about it and helped bring it to sort of an audience that was maybe not familiar with it before. Where I'm from, people always used herbal medicine, but in a lot of places, people have kind of lost those traditions because we live in a very heavily commodified material culture where most of our problems are solved by paying someone for something, by buying something. If you go into your house, probably most of the things that you have in your house were bought from somewhere, and probably they were bought at retail from a shop that bought them from somewhere else. And they likely changed hands a few times before they got to you. So it's a very commodified material culture where we don't make so much stuff ourselves, and we don't have as many traditions where we're getting things directly from our environment. And so for a lot of people living in that kind of way, herbal medicine had gotten a lot less popular over the course of the 100 years or so between 1870 and 1970. And since then, it's been getting more popular. It's kind of been coming back into fashion, or people have started to reappreciate the value of it. And Rosemary was part of that process, an influential part of that process. And so a lot of people learned about fire cider from her. And then a few years ago, a company trademarked the name fire cider and started suing people who were calling their products fire cider, even though some of them had been making them since before that company was around. And there was a big lawsuit about it, and eventually the herbalists won, and the company ended up losing, even though they had the trademark granted to them. It was determined that that was granted to them in error, and so it was kind of a big dust up in the herbal industry, and they announced at a conference that Aoife and I were at in 2019. They announced that they'd gotten the results of the court case, and so that was very gratifying to see that happen. But fire cider is one example of a compound maceration, a formula that is made rather than by combining finished extracts. It's combined and then extracted. And in a lot of traditional medical systems, this is more the rule than the exception. That you would have compounds that are made up like that. Maybe they would be family recipes. That's another kind of advantage that it has had historically, is that if you mix a bunch of stuff together and then make an extract of it, maybe people can't tell exactly what it is. Maybe it would be difficult or impossible for anyone to reproduce it without seeing how you do it. And so that has maybe provided some security to some people in terms of being the only ones that could purvey their unique blend. Of course, in modern times, it's considered ethically appropriate to tell people what you're giving them, or at least make that knowledge available to them. They might not be interested. Most people aren't, but you can't keep it secret from them, or it's you can, but it's kind of considered shady to do so anymore. But historically, people have done that a lot, and it wasn't always considered shady. It was often just kind of considered business as usual, or of course you're not going to give away your recipe. So sometimes formulas like that have been closely guarded secrets. They don't have to be in any particular medium. So you can have a compound maceration that's in cider or vinegar, or you can have it in a tincture form, or you can have it in a hot water form, or possibly even things like oil and butter and stuff like that have been used as well. A lot of the time, just like what I talked about when we were talking about formulas before, where there would be like a main maybe a main herb and some helper herbs and things like that. In a compound maceration, you're still going to have that same situation where you want everything that's in there to be working well together, and that's you just kind of a different way of bringing them together, of putting them together. Some of the things, one traditional remedy that I make that is also a compound, it's not only compounded and macerated, it's compounded and macerated and then fermented, which is root beer. Root beer is a traditional tonic that is meant to work on the lymph system and the liver and kind of detoxify the body. And what can be put in it is very variable, but in mine, I use a combination of a few different things. I use three things, which is sassafras, which gives it its flavor mainly, sarsaparilla, which makes it foamy and which probably helps to bind and bring out the flavors from the sassafras, and then maple syrup, which gives it sort of the stock that the yeast can ferment and turn into carbon dioxide, and if you leave it to ferment long enough, alcohol. So the way that I would make that is to chop up a bunch of roots of sarsaparilla and chop up a bunch of roots or bark of sassafras and bring them to a boil together, simmer them for 20 minutes or so. And when I say a bunch of them, I'm talking about something along the lines of 1 pound of roots total to a gallon of liquid. So maybe you would get a half a pound of sarsaparilla and a half a pound of sassafras. Bring it to a boil, simmer it for 20 minutes, and then let it steep overnight, possibly over a couple nights. And then add some maple syrup and some either yeast or some of the dregs from a previous fermentation project, which would also be yeast. But sometimes I actually buy yeast, and sometimes I use yeast that I already have going from a previous fermentation project. So sometimes I capture yeast from the wild, but that's a different process. So the sugar and the yeast, the maple syrup and the yeast, are just there to make the fermentation happen. If you wanted to drink it as tea, it would be perfectly fine. It would be medicinal. It would be kind of flat. But it would still work on the lymph system and the digestive system and the liver. It'd still be moving the fluids in the body. 1 pound roots to a gallon of water. And how much syrup is variable. It's kind of a matter of to taste, but it also depends on, do you want it to be alcoholic? And if so, how long do you want to ferment it for? And how strong do you want it to get? But you could use a cup, 8 fluid ounces of maple syrup in that quantity, and it would be pretty decent. It would taste, not overpoweringly sweet, not as sweet as soda, but it would definitely have a sweet flavor to it. And then if you let it ferment, if you add the yeast and then let it ferment overnight or for about 36 hours, you'll get, especially if it's in sort of an open, like a bowl that's covered with a cheesecloth, but it's not sealed, you'll get a fizzy drink that it doesn't really have any alcohol in it. It doesn't have any, technically there's probably some alcohol in it, but way less than 1%, not a significant amount of alcohol. So that's just kind of a traditional Eastern Kentucky fizzy drink. They wouldn't have always used maple syrup. A lot of the time, traditionally, they would have used white sugar. I like the maple syrup better. I think it goes better with the flavor of the other things. But that's to feed the yeast and for taste. And if you're fermenting it in a closed system where gas can escape, but air can't get in, you can ferment it for 6 weeks or so, and that sugar will all get turned into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So then you'll have a fizzy drink that has alcohol in it. If you want it to be actually more like a beer kind of level of strength, rather than something like somewhere between soda and kombucha. So yeah, that's another example of a compound where the herbs are cooked together and sort of benefit each other, or work together to create a cohesive finished product. The question of how much yeast. So usually if I buy yeast, I use a packet of yeast. And if I add yeast from a previous project, I add 4 ounces of lees from whatever I was using. In other words, half a cup. But the thing about the yeast is it makes more of itself once it gets in there. And so it's not as important how much of it you use, because it will kind of reproduce and build a stable population in the culture medium, in the sugary liquid. So yeah, it's if you use a very small amount, like if you were to use less than a packet, it would take a while for the fermentation to get going. But if you use a packet in a gallon, there's plenty of yeast. No, it's fine for all the questions. I don't mind them at all. Yeah. Another compound that I used to make more often as a compound tincture is well, there are a couple of them. One that I used to make was pergoric. I don't really have that on the shelves right now. That was a tincture of opium with a little bit of camphor added to it. So the opium is a gum, the camphor is a gum. You add the alcohol and it dissolves both of them together, and you get camphorated tincture of opium, which is well, it's a strong pain reliever. It's a strong painkiller, and it is illegal to have because of the opium. But it's a very strong pain reliever, anesthetic, and the camphor keeps it from having as strong of an effect on respiratory drive and on peristalsis. So it doesn't keep you from, it doesn't keep you from breathing, and it doesn't keep your guts from working. That's another kind of compound tincture. But another one that I've often made in the past is lobelia and cayenne together. Lobelia and cayenne kind of are as a combination were favored by Thompsonian medicine, which was a tradition of American herbalism that was very popular in the, I guess, late 1700s and early 1800s, based partly on Native American herbalism and Native American hygienic practices like sweating, which, some cultures in Europe used sweat houses as well, but Thompson learned about it from the Native Americans. Cayenne and lobelia together are meant to help with making you sweat more if you're doing sweating for therapeutic purposes, and if you take them in larger amounts, purging, making people throw up. But I don't really, the whole purging and bloodletting and powerful laxatives and things like that were very popular in uh, the herbal medicine of the 1800s is something that I don't really tend to gravitate towards. So I don't really make that compound tincture anymore, although I do combine the two sometimes, often with garlic as a remedy for people with Lyme disease. And it does seem to help with some of the long-term effects of Lyme disease. So another place where you encounter compound maceration a lot, and really kind of the place where it shines the most, I would say, is in food. If you think about a soup, it's essentially a compound maceration of a bunch of different products. And soup is often medicinal. Soup has often been explicitly and intentionally medicinal. You get something like the bone broth, which is nourishing. Often there are carbs thrown in for extra calories, like potatoes or noodles or something like that. And then along with that, a bunch of herbs, spices, things like tarragon or sage, thyme, rosemary. All of these are very they're very strong medicines. They're not very dramatic medicines in terms of being dangerous, but they contain very large amounts of secondary phytochemicals like essential oils, volatile oils, aromatic acids, things like that. So, soups are a very excellent medium for getting herbs into people, and one that, people whose role was to nurture their family have often used. And you've got to eat, so why not make it healing as well? So the nice thing about food is, as a medium for extracting herbal stuff, is that it often contains water and fat as well. And because of the complex, non-homogenized nature of food, those things don't really clash with each other the way that they might in just a liquid extract. And as we talked about last time, you can't force the things to be combined in a homogenized medicinal preparation. But if you've got something that has multiple different textures on the same plate or in the same bowl, it's not really a problem that there are some droplets of oil and that there's some water and that sort of thing. And so it's fine. It's very good for extracting both the oil soluble and water soluble components of different herbs and combining them together. So I really, with my own family, food has always been one of the main ways that I like to deliver medicine. I'm not really cooking for people in the clinic, not feeding them or sending them home with food usually, but in some cases I have, but not usually. So it's not the most convenient thing in a clinical scenario, but it is definitely a really nice thing to have in the sort of situation where you've got somebody that you're taking care of, where you're doing supportive care for a sick person, and you can make them, oatmeal with some spices in it that might help them feel better. Or you can make them soup with different herbs that could help them feel better, or even salad, or various other things. Mushrooms can be very healing, and cooking and eating a large quantity of them is a great way to get these substances like beta glucans that modulate the immune system into your body. If you're, making a soup that's got a bunch of mushrooms in it, maybe shiitake mushrooms, maybe just button mushrooms, they all contain some of the same immune modulating substances. And then along with that, you can have things like garlic that kills germs, oregano that also kills germs using different substances, and maybe basil that's uplifting to the mood, and so on. So it's very possible to combine a bunch of a bunch of different powerful medicines into one formula that doesn't even feel like medicine. It just feels like being fed and taken care of, and that by itself is a very powerful therapeutic process. So that's something to think about when you're cooking, is that it's an excellent opportunity for making compound extracts of different medicinal substances. Hang on a second, I will be right back. Oh, I would love if you would share a recipe for rabbit stew. Um, Maybe you could send it to the group text or something. That would be very nice. I would very much appreciate that, and I will probably make it. Chicken soup is something that most people are in the U.S. and also in lots of other places are familiar with as a medium for giving people medicine, or being, a medicinal food. It's very digestible, and it's a readily available source of fats and proteins and that sort of thing. But and in China, there's also chicken soup that has some more medicinal herbs in it, like ginseng and astragalus, that are bitter, which are, we don't have a lot of bitter things that we put in food in most European food traditions, especially as far as herbs and things go. But you can. Where I'm from, squirrel and gravy is considered kind of a medicinal type of food, something that someone would eat when they were sick, rather the way that chicken soup is as well. And in the city, people don't have, we have squirrels, but people don't eat them here. And I don't know why exactly, other than that maybe they just had plenty of other things to eat. But squirrels are definitely something that people eat in the mountains, and that fattiness is considered to be like kind of edifying, kind of a something that puts the strength back into you, because it's very high in calories. And often it's made in a way that it's like peppery and spicy, and would decongest and replenish, well, and help with the movement of fluid in the body as well. So that's another a different way of conveying medicine into the body. You don't usually, it's not something that that people think a lot about outside of that cultural context. But they're small game animals. Often they eat a lot of medicinal plants. They eat a lot of they eat a lot of wild plants and food and stuff, and so they're actually, to some extent, accumulating in their bodies some of the medicinal substances from those things, which then get passed on to the people who eat them. Okay, I need to come over here and plug in again. No, if it is my phone on my charging cord, I hope it's my charging cord because it's a lot easier to replace. But charging my phone is not going the way that I would normally expect it to. It's not taking quite so well. So when you combine things, there are a few things you need to watch out for. Because it's not exactly anything goes. There are things that will ruin each other. So, it's important to be aware of that as well. So anything that is very sour, along with something that is very bitter, is kind of an iffy combination that might not work out. So if you had something like, say, golden seal, for instance. Golden seal is a very bitter plant, contains a lot of alkaloids. If you were to combine that with something very sour, like the sumac fruit that I mentioned earlier, golden seal and sumac both work on the kidneys. So maybe it would seem like it would be a good idea to combine the two in a single extract together. But actually, if you do that, it ruins both of them, because the acids from the sumac fruit degrade the alkaloids from the golden seal, and instead of two very miraculous substances, you end up with a bunch of kind of not so miraculous stuff that doesn't seem to work so well for either thing. It loses a lot of its bitterness, and it just, like, you can tell that something has changed in it, that has weakened both of them rather than them working in synergy. So very bitter and very sour, sometimes it works. Some things can go okay together, but most of the time it's something that I would not combine together in a single maceration. A lot of the time it's not a problem if you're just combining them into a formula or having them both taken at the same time. But when they're extracting together for a period of months or something like that, then often they'll take something out of each other. The other thing is, if something is very thickening, if one of the substances is very thickening to the liquid, it might keep the liquid from as effectively extracting the medicines from other herbs. So if you have, for instance, marshmallow root, when you make an extract of marshmallow root, it tends to come out very thick and kind of gloppy, kind of slimy. And that slime is not going to permeate other herbs as well as pure water would. So you actually would do better to, if you were making, say, a combination of marshmallow and stinging nettle, which I use all the time. It's like one of my go-to kidney support combinations, is nettle to stimulate the kidneys and marshmallow to soothe them as they're being stimulated, so that they don't end up feeling overworked. And I use that every week, not every day, but more than once a week in my clinical practice. And it's if you were to make a compound extract of them, you might not get as much out of the nettle as if you extracted them separately, just because the texture of the liquid would be changed so much by the marshmallow root that it might not do an effective job of extracting the minerals and low molecular weight proteins and some of the other substances that are in the nettle.
Andrew, I have a question.
Okay.
I'm full of questions, sorry. Can you make a marshmallow tincture and it work effectively? It just kind of seems weird to me just because it gets so, gloppy. I don't know. It just seems like it
Yeah, I
wouldn't
mean,
work,
you
but maybe
can.
it does.
No, yeah, it works. It works. Yeah, usually I use bigger pieces of marshmallow root when I'm making a tincture. Like I'll have the roots sliced rather than like ground up or crushed. Uh, the powder is better for things where you're using it more as directly as a thickener. But if you want to make a tincture out of it, you can, yeah, have the roots. I usually grow the roots for this one and slice them up. You can also buy cut and sifted marshmallow root, which is not terribly tiny chunks of it, and it's not powder, but it's not slices either. It's just like little bits. But yeah, you can make a tincture out of that, and it'll be slimy. Um, it'll be thickened, but you can do it. And usually I have that in the stock jar, and I use a turkey baster to pipette stuff out to suck some of it up, and then put that in with the other tinctures in a compound that I'm making. But yeah, it's somewhat thick for using with you know combining things and then extracting them. Cinnamon is not as thick as marshmallow, but it can get pretty gloppy too. Their slippery elm is another one that would be, a concern for the same reason. Um, so yeah, there are a whole bunch of different herbs that that may or may not work so well in compound extracts just because of how thick they are. But also that's going to partly depend on how much of them you use in the compound. So if you had something that had a little bit of marshmallow in it and a bunch of other herbs, probably wouldn't be a problem. But if it's it just comes down to how thick it's going to make the finished product. And then
Can marshmallow be effective, like if you were to place them in like veggie caps, perhaps?
yeah, depending on what you want it to do, it would be good for the digestive system. It might not do so well at soothing other parts of the body because it might not get absorbed enough or mixed with enough water by the time it gets to the part of your intestine where slippery stuff would get absorbed into your bloodstream, which is in the first part of the small intestine. So yeah, it can be effective as a gel cap, or I mean, as encapsulated in gelatin or whatever, or veggie caps, but it just kind of depends on where you want it to go in the body. If you were going to try and have it go somewhere other than the digestive tract for its soothing effects, you would probably want to at least take it with a lot of water so that it
Okay,
would
cool.
break apart the capsule and start the process of turning into slime.
Thank you. Sorry for all the questions.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. So, there are also some herbs that just contain molecules that are just kind of delicate that don't do so well with being made into compound macerations. And an example of that might be echinacea. Good quality echinacea extract has a really tingly feeling in your mouth. It's kind of like I would describe it as a different flavor that only a few herbs have, and not much of anything else. But it has this like really tingly, mouth-watering feeling. Prickly ash has something along the same lines, and so do a few other herbs. Those types of herbs, usually if they're combined with anything very acidic, it will just kind of ruin that, and you just won't get that flavor, and you won't get that kind of effect by which it stimulates the parotid glands and makes the immune system function better. So yeah, those particular herbs don't do well with some other things that they could be combined with. And so to some extent, it's a little bit of a matter of trial and error. Um, but I can at least pass on to you some trials that I've already made, some things that I've already tried. Um, the other thing is, when you're combining herbs, you do have to think about what the flavor of the final product is going to be. And if it's two things that can clash a lot with each other, it's probably best not to combine them. And that's not necessarily specifically a matter of compound maceration. That could go with putting things in formulas too. Um, but some flavors just don't work so well together. Um, and people have different ideas about what that is, but sweet and pungent can be a kind of an odd combination. If you have something that's like uh that's very pungent, uh like, for example, horseradish. If you were going to combine that with something that were more sweet, like violets, for instance, violets and horseradish would be a really weird combination. They both work on pain, but I don't know that I could really enjoy taking both of them together. So a lot of the time, if I have two things that I feel like the flavors are just going to be really strange together, I'll give them to people in separate things. Maybe they'll have a sweet compound and a more savory compound. Um, yeah, garlic and lavender. It's not a combination that I ever put together. Even though there might be people who would benefit from it, I'm definitely putting those into two separate bottles, and that way you don't have a person taking something that feels so unfamiliar to them. Um, there are situations in food where pungent and sweet can go together well, like garlic and lemon are frequently combined in food, and they work well together. Uh, but I usually I think that's just because a matter of there being enough other flavors that make them work together. Um, and I wouldn't really combine them. Anything floral with anything kind of seaweedy is also something that I usually try to avoid. Um, yeah. So, any questions about the general concept or process of compound maceration? Question of, do I use fresh or dried roots for root beer? I usually use dried because I'm usually making it in the winter time, or, well, the time of year that I gather sassafras is late winter, early spring. And at that point, I usually do make a batch of fresh stuff, but the rest of the year it would be dried, and they work very well as dried herbs. Um, as far as the ratio of marshmallow and nettle leaf, I usually do twice as much nettle leaf as marshmallow, if I'm doing a compound with both of those. Sometimes I do equal parts. Um, but because the nettle is kind of like, usually what I'm trying to do is stimulate the kidneys without overworking them. So stimulate them and soothe them. So the stimulating them part is kind of like the main thing I'm trying to do, which is what the nettle is for. So I'm using more of it. And then the marshmallow is kind of like the damage control. Um, so I'm using usually not as much of it as I am of the nettle. So usually it's something like two parts of nettle leaf tincture to one part of marshmallow tincture, uh, if I'm combining just those two together. Um, Although it would differ depending on the individual needs of the person that I'm giving it to or making it up for. Mhm. Do people who find nettle drying tolerate this well? Yes, yes. Generally speaking, this would be helpful to make the nettle less drying to those people. So that's kind of the idea, um, or part of the idea, I guess. Another place where I like to make a compound maceration is I talked a while back about using buckthorn bark um, as as a strong laxative. Um, so, and as I said at the time, I pretty much only use it for people who have been on opiates and are coming off of them. Because they have terrible constipation, or not necessarily that they're coming off of them. Maybe they're not coming off of them, but people who have been on opiates and who are trying to get past the constipation that causes, which can be very unpleasant and sometimes even life-threatening. So the buckthorn is really good for that, but it does cause cramping and it does cause some intense discomfort, or it can have a very strong effect. So sometimes I make a combination that is half buckthorn with the other half being equally divided amongst ginger and garlic, not garlic, ginger and licorice, and combine those three things together and then make a 5-to-1 tincture out of those in 50% alcohol. And then that is a compound, an aromatic extract of the buckthorn bark, which is less crampy, it's a little less strong because it's only half buckthorn, but it's warming the intestines up as it passes through them instead of just irritating them and forcing things out. So it's sometimes not necessarily less effective, but less dramatically effective, and less painful and less of an abrupt transition. So they're not going straight from being extremely constipated for days or weeks to having extreme diarrhea. So that's another extract that I do keep in my clinic that is made as a compound maceration. All right. All right. Any questions about any of that? Well, have you ever heard of marshmallow root causing gas? I don't know if I've ever specifically heard of that with marshmallow root. There are definitely some people who get gas from starchy roots. And what's going on there is that the gut bacteria are breaking down starches that the human metabolism can't turn into sugars and absorb. So it ends up acting as a substrate for gut bacteria, and the gut bacteria producing gas. Jerusalem artichokes are like pretty much famous for that. But I can't really say that I've ever heard anybody say that marshmallow did that to them, or that have anybody come to me and say, oh, the marshmallow that you gave me really caused a lot of gas. So it's totally plausible, but it's not something that I tend to see in practice. If it does happen to someone in particular, then I'm not too surprised. But it might be more just a matter of having that vegetable matter in there that the bacteria can grow on. Is it possible to be allergic to marshmallow root? I think it's possible to be allergic to just about anything. As far as plants and foods go. It's definitely not an allergy that you see a lot of, because most allergies are to proteins, and there's not a lot of protein in marshmallow root. That doesn't mean that there's zero. So yeah, it's possible. It's not common though. Yeah. Any other questions about any of that? Okay, so I know I mentioned this last week, and I will mention it again on Friday of this week, 6 o'clock. If anybody wants to come over to the house, I'm making some food with some wild foods that I've foraged and things like that. So there's going to be some venison and some dried fruit and some probably stew and something with mushrooms, and I'm not sure what all, but it'll be decent food and hopefully good company. I've invited a bunch of other people that I know and stuff, but if any of you would like to come, you are certainly welcome to. And if you need the address, just text me or whatever. And yeah, Friday at 6, that's December 23rd at 6 o'clock, we'll be doing that. Oh, and there's some Applejack that I made, if you like that sort of thing, which is basically like brandy made by freezing the apple wine and taking away the water from it and leaving behind the alcohol and other stuff so that it becomes more concentrated. So yeah, if anybody wants to join me for that, you'd be very much welcome.
Awesome.
All right. Any other questions for today? Well, if you are able to, I would love to. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and I will talk to you again next week. And I hope that everybody has a happy Christmas, or if you don't celebrate Christmas, then a happy December 25th. And I will talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.